Hi, this is Jason Leslie, a Pioneer rep from Bellwood, Ontario, and this is the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. If you've been listening to the last few episodes, you'll remember our conversation on fertility with Dave Hooker and Greg Stopps. It was the first one in this third season. Well, today we're going back to that theme, but focusing on nitrogen in corn this time. After all, side dressing is in full force in our area, and the question to ask this episode is, are we headed in the right direction with our application rate, or is there something we should be doing differently? We've got three great guests lined up to help answer that question, starting with Ben Rosser, the corn specialist for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation, Andrew.
In your role at OMAFRA, Ben, obviously fertility of that corn crop is a big focus, and with another application of nitrogen going on for a lot of growers right now, we wanted to check in to see what should we be thinking about when going to do that. Now, in the past, we know that you've done the pre-side dress nitrogen test survey, or the PSNT. Now, not this year, but can you still talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, for sure. So traditionally, the last 10 plus, maybe 15 years, starting with my predecessor, Greg Stewart, we've always conducted a survey across the province. So just prior to side dress time, we would go and try to sample about 100 cornfields across the province that haven't received any nitrogen. So no broadcast applications or that sort of thing, maybe starter if it's been kept in the ban and we can avoid it, just to really get a snapshot of background natural soil mineralized nitrogen and across a large number of fields, and then just compare that variability year to year to get an idea of, just prior to side dress timing, are we seeing levels that are a little bit lower than normal? Are we seeing levels a little bit higher than normal, kind of average? Just to give growers some general indication of what at least nitrate levels look like just prior to side dress timing each year.
Now, with having that data year to year and seeing the fluctuations year to year, what do you think causes some of the changes in those nitrogen levels?
Yeah, so the release of nitrogen in the soil depends on microbes. And, that's largely dependent on temperature and moisture conditions. So very, very generally speaking, the earlier and warmer spring you have, that tends to kick them into gear maybe a little bit quicker. If you have a really delayed spring, it might slow the release of nitrogen. And we kind of hope to try to pick that up when we do this survey. It's not perfect, but we hope to at least get a really general idea. There's some other things like moisture that will come into play too. If it's too dry or excessively wet, that can impact things as well. But those would be the kind of things that we think would have the biggest influences year to year in terms of the variability we've seen in the survey in the past.
Then can you tie that in with some of the other research I know you've done, particularly with the University of Guelph? I mean, what kind of data are you pulling in that research that might help a grower determine, especially with the year like this when the price is so high, just how can a grower go about their side dressing most efficiently?
Yeah, so one challenge of our survey has been finding fields that we can still sample. So even in the last 5 years, it's become increasingly difficult just as growers have shifted towards more upfront nitrogen or different ways of applying nitrogen. Some recent research that was done at the Allure Research Station by Bill Dean, who recently retired as cropping system professor in plant ag department here at Guelph, looked at a long-term corn nitrogen trial. It was in the exact same field over 10 years, and there's a fair bit of variability and variability in yields as well as N rates over the years. So himself and his grad student at the time, a little while ago, Caleb Niemeyer, kind of analyzed all the data, and they showed some pretty cool things. They found that the corn yields year to year, again, exact same piece of ground every year, so it's not a field variability thing, was really well related to rainfall during the June 15th to kind of July 15th window. So, not season long, not rainfall during the grain fill period. It was really during that June 15 to July 15 window that rainfall was really well correlated to corn yields. And the other thing at the Allure location was that nitrogen rates were also really well related to corn yields. So again, if you have a measure of rainfall during that period, or again, if you're making an in-crop application, maybe you know the rainfall at the beginning and you have to use the forecast for the second half. You can get a pretty good idea, at least at Elora, what the optimum N rate is going to be with rainfall in that period. And generally speaking, in their data set, every millimeter of rain you received in that window would increase the optimum N rate by about 1.5 pounds per acre, above a base rate of about 100 or 110 pounds of nitrogen.
But I guess I'm more curious that is there such a thing as too much rain when you're looking at your millimeter to 1.5 pounds of N?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So in the Elora data set, I don't have the rainfall amounts handy, but the highest yielding year was about 220 or 230 bushels. And in that year, it needed about 220 pounds of nitrogen was the optimum N rate. So in that year, they didn't seem to saturate things, at least at Elora. I think there's a couple of caveats when you look at the Elora data set. One is that, there doesn't tend to be a lot of nitrogen loss at Elora. So, even in years where things are really wet, they compared pre-plant and side dress timings. There never tended to be a yield lag for the pre-plant relative to side dress. So it would suggest that at least at Elora, this method would be fairly reliable where there's low loss risks. But if you're on a soil like a heavier texture, poorer drained soil in Ontario, where nitrogen losses might be much more of an issue, this data set or the relationship between the two might not be nearly as clean as what it is at Elora when losses come into play.
Trials do sound like a good way to make this research more farm specific. So Ben, thanks for all this information.
No problem. Thanks again, Andrew.
Next up, we've got Paul Hermans, an area agronomist with Pioneer in Eastern Ontario, and Brett McArtor, a field trial specialist with Corteva Digital based in Iowa. Now, Paul and Brett actually do quite a bit of work together on several trials here in Ontario, including on these nitrogen levels. So we've brought them both in to talk about what they're finding. Brett, Paul, thanks very much for joining the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, Brett and Paul, the reason we've got you both together on this call, which isn't something we do every day for the podcast, but it's one of those where you two actually do quite a bit of work together, at least in the virtual space, doing nitrogen trials here in Ontario, stuff that we just got off the phone with Ben about. Paul, maybe I could start with you in terms of what that research you two are doing and what is it for here in Ontario?
Well, Andrew, I guess if you take a look, the folks in the U.S. are really lucky. They have a nitrogen model program that they can use with customers to get more value on every acre. And here in Ontario and actually in Canada, we don't have that capability. So what Brett, myself, and a bunch of other people within Corteva are doing is looking at research background data to hopefully try and get a model that we can use here in Ontario to bring to our customers to get better use of nitrogen going forward.
So then, Brett, maybe you can kind of bring, you're in Iowa. Can you bring that perspective of what does that data look like in the U.S. first? And then as you're doing the research, what are you finding here in Ontario?
Yeah, so, first and foremost, I'm located in the U.S. and we have our model here. The real value of doing the research in Ontario is getting local data and information in Ontario in those environments. You guys farm, we're all raising corn, but you guys do farm slightly different. You guys have a slightly different environment, slightly different soils. So utilizing these trials, it helps us from an internal standpoint just to understand, first of all, hey, what do we need to tweak? What do we need to think about? What do we need to work on our model before we introduce it into the Canadian market? How it looks like our data and information in the U.S. versus in Ontario really isn't all that different. We still maybe, one thing that we ran into a little bit is sometimes you guys get a little earlier frost date, earlier frost in Ontario, in the northern regions than we do here in the U.S. And that's something we needed to account for in our model. But really, ultimately, as far as nitrogen management goes, it's not a whole lot different. It's just kind of understanding how nitrogen works within the soils in Ontario.
And I'd add to that, Andrew, too, and Brett talked about the soils. And one of the big differences with the U.S. and Canada is the U.S. has got a great soil database, digital database that feeds into the models. Unfortunately, we don't have that here in Ontario to the scope that we need or the scale that we need it. So we're trying to do that background work to ensure that we have it. So it's kind of something I think going forward, to put a plug in for the government and all industry members, maybe that's something we can work together as to get a better soil database for Ontario, because there's a lot of different models that we could use that for going forward.
And I would tag a little bit in with what Paul said there on the soils. If you're not familiar with what the U.S. soil database looks like, what I see you guys have in Ontario is like one field will be one soil type, where here in the U.S. it's much more detailed than that, where I can have 10 or 15 soil types in one 80-acre field, and it's just different patches. And you guys see that too in your fields. You see little sand lenses, you'll see depressional areas, you'll see higher areas, and those are all different soil types, and nitrogen works differently in all those little different pockets within a field that we need to be able to account for.
So then really this is doing two projects at once. You're kind of combining, you're trying to pull together some of this soil information at the same time as figuring out, is what we're doing from a nitrogen management standpoint going to work in this soil type, in this environment, in this province?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, that's a big job.
Hit the hammer on the head. Yeah, and it's the big thing. I think a lot of people think about, hey, different corn hybrids respond different by nitrogen, but we've shown, Jason to Brian, there's no big differences, hybrid A versus B by nitrogen response, but it's more that environment aspect. And that's the thing, what we have to, talk to growers about. How do you manage your nitrogen? And to me, it's by environment, it's by field. And that's where this model kind of comes into play.
So then maybe we can talk a little bit about that data over the last few years, Brett, in terms of what you've seen. Has anything kind of surprised you about it? What have you seen that you think's relevant to growers who are, as we're recording this and as we're posting it, are probably getting ready, if not already, splitting 28 in?
Yep. And it's worked out, actually, setting up these trials the last 2 years in 2020 into 2021 to have a 2 years that would contrast each other so much has worked out beautifully from a nitrogen research standpoint. So at least in Ontario area, 2020, if you guys recall, was fairly dry and not exactly a bin busting year. I believe over the trials that we had in 2020, which would have been maybe 11 or 12 locations, I think we probably averaged right around 155 bushels an acre. And then compare that to 2021, which was an excellent year, very good yields. Another, I believe 15 trial locations in 2021, and we averaged close to 200 bushels per acre across those trials. So just those two contrasting environments worked out great for nitrogen research, just to see, hey, in a dry year, what kind of yields could we expect, and then also what kind of nitrogen will that take. So the trials we set up include 5 different nitrogen rates. And I try to base those off of the grower's normal farmer rate, whatever you'd call that. That would be my 100% treatment. And then we'll do a 0%, a 50, 75, that 100% farmer rate, and then 150% rate, just to see what we could shoot for the top end when nitrogen is not a limiting factor. And what we see across both years, if you combine them, is that 2020, about that 50% rate would have put you right on the razor's edge of maximum nitrogen rate to achieve 95% yield. But if you put yourself on that same razor's edge in 21, you would have cut yourself short by a fair margin, anyways. What I hope we can do with our nitrogen model is we'll ingest weather with that, and then we can start to pivot and understand, hey, this is what the year's setting up like. Maybe you need to consider side dressing 75 pounds of nitrogen. Maybe you consider not applying any nitrogen in season. Just that's really where we hope our nitrogen model can shine to help with those contrasting years and how to manage your nitrogen that way.
And then there's one key thing, Andrew, that we did too, is we tried to get with our growers is to put, no more than 30 or 40 pounds up front, and then come back and side dress on those different rates that Brett talked about. It's really trying to get that delta yield. So if we have a 0 or let's say a 30 or 40 pound up front, and then compare that to the high rate, what's the difference between the two? That gives a really good indication of what I call how the soils can cook nitrogen or mineralize nitrogen through the growing season. And again, it's that, hot, dry year, we're going to get a lot more mineralization versus a cold, wet year, those kind of things. And that all fits into the model that Brett talks about beforehand.
So then, Paul, in this position we're in now, I mean, it's early June. There's lots of season left to go. Knowing that, what's going to be the difference in terms of that uptake of the plant, how do you manage that then at this moment? Or is it a case of do we have to change how we manage that, knowing that if it's dry, it's going to do one thing, if it's wet, it's going to do another?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different things that play into that. I think first thing is just getting, hopefully by this time folks have done stand counts, and that's going to give us, a good indication of what kind of populations out there, what the yield potential is. So if I have a 25,000 stand and I was shooting for 30,000, well, I don't quite have as much yield potential there. I think maybe Brett can talk about one thing about nitrogen use efficiency, and we saw differences based on yield level in our last couple of years.
Typically here in the U.S., and we saw in Ontario as well, kind of a rule of thumb would be a 1-to-1 or 1.2, which indicates 1 pound of nitrogen for 1 bushel of yield, or 1.2 pounds of nitrogen to 1 bushel of yield. And really what we've seen is as you get into a higher yield environment where you're able to cook more nitrogen and your soils are mineralizing more nitrogen, you can get by with less, frankly. So you don't need that 1-to-1 if you're pushing 220 bushels of corn. You can get by with maybe 0.9. So you can get by with 0.9 pounds of nitrogen for every bushel that you're making. So you don't necessarily need to go up 1-to-1 as you see your yields increase.
So there really is a case of, there is, and it's easy to say at this point, but there is too much to put on. It is a case of just because you think the yield is there and you've got lots of potential doesn't mean you need to flood that on, that there is that limiting factor there.
It's hard to get customers or growers to reduce that fuel in the fuel tank, right? Think about doing a trip, and I want to get to the end of my trip. Well, I'm going to make my tank full or halfway or that kind of thing, right? So growers tend to want to put a few more pounds on just to make sure that they don't run out at the end of the year. But I think this year, especially with nitrogen prices and shortages and everything else, growers are looking a lot closer at how can I manage my nitrogen, and that comes into different rates and everything else, but also other additives and things like biologicals going forward.
And that's what some of our model too. I mean, we can give you an indication of kind of what that gas gauge is looking like. So Paul, you had mentioned the PSNT test. We model that output as well for parts per million of nitrate in the soil. So there's also an indicator that we can do that. In that, we do that within each zone or fields or whatever. So it'll help manage some variability within your field.
I know that's going to come out later time-wise, but we just pulled our soil samples yesterday for the 6 trials that I have. So 4 replications in each trial. So we'll have a database based on that just to give us an idea of how much nitrogen is in the soil based on, soil texture. We do in these studies, CEC, organic matter. Then we take a look at crop rotation. We got a couple guys with manure, not manure, throw all those kind of concepts together, and it kind of helps us build, a database and then builds into the model that Brett and the crew are working on.
Yep. And you mentioned the soil texture that we pick up there. One thing that's important as far as gaining better soils knowledge is, so when you go out and collect that soil core, how most folks would collect the soil core is you collect the top 6 to 8 inches. And yes, we have that texture there. But what I need to know is what's below that, because your roots obviously are going, 5 or 6 feet deep, and they're accessing fertility down that deep as well. So where our soils database here in the U.S. gives us down to 100 centimeters, that's what we need to know and understand within Ontario as well is what's the soils look like at depth. And I did a little research prior to this podcast, Andrew. So I picked out a couple of counties that we've had trials in the last couple of years. I picked out Middlesex, Wellington, and Stormont counties, and I looked up just some of their main soil types that they have in those areas just to get an idea of what those soil profiles look like. And I was looking for something particular here. It's something that we run into here, and particularly we run it in Iowa, in southern Iowa, that makes it nitrogen management a little bit more of a challenge versus other soils. And so comparing like in Wellington, like your Guelph soil, which is frankly a beautiful soil, as I looked at as it goes from a very heavy, silt percentage, and it just slowly transitions to sand and it drains beautifully and it works out excellent. But in contrast would be like your Perth clay loam soil, where what we run into is you run into a clay pan at 36 to 48 centimeters. And that's something similar that we run into in southern Iowa as well. If you follow how the water goes and your nitrogen attaches to your water, it hits that clay pan and it doesn't want to percolate any farther down the soil profile. Then it starts to move horizontally through the soil profile. And then that also restricts root growth as well. So as far as our modeling standpoint goes, knowing that type of information is very important.
Well, and that's I gotta give you credit, Brett. That's a nice wide range of the province too, going from Stormont all the way down here to Middlesex. So
I hope that gives an indication of the research that we've done.
So then, Paul, I mean, in terms of the last couple of years of having this data from Brett and working with that Corteva digital team in the R&D side, I mean, what are you learning in terms of, particularly, as Brett mentioned, in terms of that, dry year to the contrast of the wet year? What are you learning and what are you bringing to your customers and to the growers of Eastern Ontario that they should be aware of, not just this year, but going forward as they think their nitrogen strategy?
Yeah, and I guess good question, Andrew. It's the biggest thing I look at is the whole, if we're going to manage nitrogen, it's got to be on an environment situation. And when we talk environment, it's that field by field situation. You can't just do a blanket approach for the whole farm operation, think more on a field by field. Learning back in the last 2 years, I really like, looking at the dry versus the wet year, the 50 versus 75% more or less grower rate. So 50% grower rate on the dry year, 75 on the wet. And then that whole nitrogen use efficiency, looking at it from a yield environment standpoint. So that's some of the information that I've taken back to our sales reps and their customers, challenge them how can they use that data in their day-to-day decisions, and then hopefully they're going to tweak some things going forward here in 2022 and beyond. And we're always learning. I mean, this will be a third year this year. Some of our sites will be the second time we're back on that same field, so it'll be interesting to see how that 2020 year did, how 2022, a different growing environment, and how the two contrast. We got those same field conditions, and can we learn something from that standpoint more on that environmental issue, again, field by field.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining the podcast today.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks, Andrew.
Next time on the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast, we move to another issue you may be thinking about with your corn crop, tar spot. As we see its prevalence grow in the province, what should we be thinking about and how can we deal with it are all coming up next time. On behalf of myself and the entire team working behind the scenes on this, thanks so much for listening. Don't forget, you can always get in touch on Twitter at Pioneer Seeds CA or my personal handle, Fresh Air Farmer. And for more info or advice, talk to your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.